Well, that might be a good opportunity to transition to Ukraine. I'm curious your take. Trump appears to be sort of going above Zelensky's head to talk with Russia. What's your sort of impression of those negotiations?
Well, I mean, Trump and Hegseth have both made very clear that, like, Ukraine is not going to get back basically the Donbass region. It's going to have to give up at least 20% of its territory. Ukraine will not be part of NATO, right? And on top of that, Trump wants to set up this extraction regime that loots, 50% of, Ukraine's critical minerals, the existence of which is overstated. But the minerals thing is it's evil, but these other positions are actually realistic positions to expect on Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine shouldn't be in NATO. What the fuck, Of course, a smaller power that's been invaded by a larger one that's winning the war is probably going to have to give up some territory as part of accommodating reality. The weird thing about it is to announce these kinds of accommodations up front before negotiations even start, and to
That's what the Democrats do.
Yeah. You said it. Yeah, that's pretty fucked up. So that's what's super weird, right? And what it inevitably means is that Ukraine is going to be rendered into a colony within what's already an American imperialist foreign policy. And the frustration for somebody like me who spent his life within the Democratic Party up to, recently is it didn't have to be this way. Putin is an imperialist and you're not going to find me apologizing for him at all. But the reality has always been that Biden came into office with a neocon hardline on Russia. Putin had made his calculation at a certain point to be fuck you. And then once the war started, we could have pushed for a resolution within months. There's concept that the scholar I. Williams Artman had, mutual hurting stalemate. It's whenever a situation is negative sum. So it's the longer time plays out, the more both sides are harmed. It's not one side gets better with time or something. In a mutual hurting stalemate, that is the context when negotiated settlements to conflicts are most likely. And we reached that point in Ukraine, literally within the first few months, right? The problem was that settlement would have required some territorial concessions. Washington's brilliant minds decided it was better to pretend we're still in the unipolar moment. You got the Mike McFalls, we got this maximalism, and then the yada, yada, yada. Ukraine is forced to eat shit. Ukraine's people are forced to eat shit. It was very predictable that if we were going to support Ukraine, we needed to have a shot clock on it, because the general election, the closer we got to it, the more likely it was Putin was just going to try to wait out Biden and hope for Trump. And that's exactly what happened. And that's the worst of all possible worlds if you're a Ukraine head, Didn't have to be this way.
Well, I mean, on this, I definitely want to get back to this this extraction deal that Trump is negotiating, because it really is wild. But on this, understanding this most recent history here, I mean, is the perspective here that Biden and his team are just sort of unwilling to accept reality? Or was it purely ideological, or was it this kind of idea that, I remember Biden saying something along the lines of what are you talking about? We're doing bad in Ukraine. We've degraded, look how many Russians have died. This idea they're going to weaken Russia, and basically use Ukraine as as a sacrifice to weaken Russia for American power. I mean, what, as far as you can understand, can we say is the logic here?
Yeah, it was kind of all of the above, right? Biden's Secretary of Defense literally said at the outset of the war that our metric of success is weakening Russia's military capacity, So we were trying to bleed them dry. And the Biden theory was the opposite of what I just said. The Biden theory was not to put a shot clock on it, but actually to play this out as long as possible, in part because they thought their own shit didn't stink. They thought that they could obviously win in 2024. Everybody thought it was a return to Aaron Sorkin's West Wing circa 2021, And so that implicit belief in your own greatness really set you up for bad analysis and bad policy. And the ideological thing, I think there's something to that, because the Biden administration, all these Bidenista guys, They were looking at Ukraine, the whole national security state pretty much looked at Ukraine as a chance for redemption for like the larger liberal hegemony project. This was a chance for American leadership to be restored. And what that does is literally it like displaces the people of Ukraine, and like they don't matter on their own terms. This is not about standing up to a bully. It's not about human solidarity. This is about redeeming the liberal internationalist project.
You know, I mean, on that, like talking about like Ukrainians, you know, you're somebody who comments on this stuff, writes on this stuff, is also on Twitter. You know, what do you have to say to some of these kind of like American liberals who act like folks like us who might have been advocating for an end to this war earlier? That, oh, you guys don't care about Ukraine. Oh, you want to sacrifice Ukraine. I mean, what would your response be to that kind of challenge from those folks?
I mean, it's pretty unserious. Like we're prioritizing, we're centering the Ukrainian people here. Like the reason for arguing for a settlement early on is out of a theory of least harm. The liberals who love Ukraine, and I think a lot of them do earnestly sort of have a fellow feeling for Ukraine as a country, they don't really see the Ukrainian people per se. It's the country, it's the abstraction that stands in for the people. And that's a huge problem because it means that their priority and the liberals' priority, as well-intentioned as it is not to approach the situation with the principle of least harm in mind. And what we were all arguing on the left from the start is that least harm has to like define the goal, you know, like what is it that we have to do to make sure the least amount of people dies here and that least amount of people get exploited. And that is just not part of the calculation that they make, you know?
You know, I'm sorry, Matt, I just wanted like to focus so much on this Ukraine stuff, but like, I also wanted to ask just really quick about like where this leaves Europe, because I think this has been like a very, not just like in terms of, I mean, like one, like the American relationship with Europe now that Trump's back in power is like very strained. But I think there's also been a kind of a reality check for them as well, right? I mean, hell, just as like this past week, it's been kind of interesting seeing some of like the grandstanding that we've been getting from European powers and then seeing them slowly start to back down on like Ukraine and, you know, providing troops, all this kind of stuff. I'm just curious, you know, your perspective on that with the recent events here.
Yeah, that's actually really like smart thing to observe because trend lines wise, it's like the big thing, you know, like Ukraine is a bit of a sideshow at this point, but like there's a larger strategic non-alignment happening, like, or the Europe is de-aligning from the US orbit. And this is, you could almost call this like non-alignment as in like Cold War non-aligned movement. And it's the bulk of Europe, but it's happening kind of like a decade later than it needed. Like we needed this energy back in the first Trump years, frankly. And it was obvious, like the writing's been on the wall that Trump is going to sort of abandon Europe in the traditional sense of like security reliance on the US. But like, yeah, now European diplomats are saying anonymously that America's the adversary, literally. You know, you have the incoming German chancellor, you have Spain. They're talking openly about like independence from the US. And there's some of that going on in like Asia and in the Pacific Islands too. So it's not just Europe. It's surprising to a lot of people because this whole Europe NATO project seemed like ironclad. But yeah, that's a big shift, epochal. And it's going to end up forcing, if Europe is like remotely realistic in how it views the world, it's going to end up forcing a more realistic assessment of China because the past 5 or 6 years, Europe has really gotten drunk on like the anti-China fetish, largely copying and pasting talking points from Washington. So like Australia does this too. Like there's this belief among elites that like if you ring the China threat bell enough, it will like rally America to your side. And Europe is going to have to rethink all of that now because you can't have the two greatest powers in the international system both being adversarial to you, you know?
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating that, you know, America voted with Russia and China abstained. Yeah,
dude, up is down now, man.
How much, you know, Trump? I welcome Bernie saying, "Look, we need to audit the Pentagon," this sort of stuff. But I also think like Trump that's not Trump's not trying to lower military spending globally. In fact, he's going around the world saying, y'all need to pick up the slack and start spending on weapons manufacturers. Is that venal? Is that for Americans' arms providers? Is that the China threat, or how do you assess that?
All of the above, yeah. Like Bernie kind of fucked up, I think. Like, I'm obviously his guy, but he again, like the media, sort of seized on the prospect of mentioning defense cuts and was like, yeah, let's do it. But it's a reallocation within the overall defense budget. And so when you look at who the Trump administration is appointing in the Pentagon, when you look at who's in control of like House and Senate Armed Services committees, they're all plotting for $200 to $300 billion increases to the military budget above what we currently have, which is approaching $1 trillion. That's what they're in the process of doing right now. That's going to keep happening no matter what Trump says. And in fact, Hegseth has even clarified that like they're not going to end up cutting the top line necessarily. So this is just about doing the whole great power rivalry thing more efficiently. Like you still have to combat China and run an imperialist foreign policy. Like, how are you going to use the military as the foot soldiers of extractivism around the world? The two operating concepts I've heard from the national security state, and this is super grim. Minerals for military assistance as a worldwide paradigm, and Monroe Doctrine to the shores of China, which is a guaranteed World War III if you take that seriously. Like, that's not going to fly with anybody, So that's what we're setting up for right now. The cuts are not. There's tons of stuff that can be cut, and there's some foreshadowing of like what will be cut within the Pentagon, but it's not going to be to the top line. It's just going to be reallocations.
Yeah, and he's going around the world saying, y'all need to spend more too. You have a piece here that I think is very interesting that goes to like the ideological split here on undiplomatic.com. J.D. Vance versus Niall Ferguson is the stupidity we deserve. I've been a Niall Ferguson hater for over a decade now.
Oh, good.
But I'm just curious, can you outline this schism on the right regarding war?
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance, you might be surprised to find out he's the vice president of the United States because he spends a lot of time on Twitter. So
he's a vice poster.
Yeah. He called Neil Ferguson a globalist peddling moralistic garbage. And when he did that, it was Vance doing like rhetorical subterfuge to defend Trump's sort of weird negotiating posture on Ukraine, right? And like everybody in the commentariat, like left, right, and center, has been shitting all over this Trump's approach to Ukraine. Well, Neil Ferguson, for people who don't know, is like the Pete Hegseth of historians. So he's like kind of a joke, but with like a large public profile, and he's also the preeminent kind of anti-populist. So he supported every war in our lifetimes. He openly advocated for imperialism, literally, like capital I, during the War on Terror years. He's just a ruling class aristocrat. He's instinctively attracted to power. And his dilemma is that the Trump presidency that he wants to be close to also wants to end a war in Ukraine that he has cheered because he's got that neocon energy. And so, if you're a court historian, what are you supposed to do in that situation? So Vance comes at him with this criticism about like Neil Ferguson throwing shade at the Trump administration for their weird Ukraine strategy. And Vance goes back at him and critiques him with this moralistic garbage line. And so Ferguson responds by publicly flagellating himself, talking about how much he loves Trump and MAGA, and if Trump had won in 2020, Putin would have never invaded Russia and all this stuff. It's just like sycophant shit, like no self-respect, And so that's the kind of, if this is what, I think he said in the newsletter, like if this is what passes for public debate, then we're screwed, But it's like, you've got a neocon who wants to be close to power, and then you've got power doing this imperialist sphere of influence stuff in Ukraine, setting them up to be a colony. It's like, this is lose-lose. Do
Do you buy the assessment that J.D. Vance won with the conservative base? And do you think that signifies any real anti-war sort of? I imagine there's some sincere anti-war feeling on the right. Like, what's your breakdown of that?
Yeah, there's a lot of anti-war energy, I think, everywhere in the working class. The problem with the right, I've written about this too. Like, they take that grievance where it's like war has just looted us, and then they redirect it toward Monroe Doctrine 2.0. They're still allocating the $1.7 trillion for nuclear modernization over 30 years that the previous president did, and the one before that, all the way back to Obama. Like, they're militarists. They're militarists and also imperialists. I think the thing that a lot of people miss is, like, when they talk about stuff like multipolarity, they are happy with creating a world in which everyone kind of like abandons international institutions, abandons alliance arrangements, and starts spending like gangbusters on their own militaries, because what that does is create a world of like ethnically homogenous nation states. They would love that. And then having your own national defense is part of that. And then in that world of just anarchy, America as the big dog can do imperialism or whatever the hell it wants unfettered. It can do primitive accumulation without the constraints of like obligation that had previously existed under like, liberal hegemony or whatever. And so it's not like American foreign policy was bad before, but it's like at least there were some like nominal sort of checks on American overreach. And now that's all gone, So, not
right.
great.
Yeah, I mean, my assessment is that like all of these right wing, especially the influencers that might support the J.D. Vance over the Niall Ferguson. First, love to see it happen to Niall and Douglas Murray for that instance too. But I think all of those people will be full throated in support of like America drone striking in Mexico in the next 4 years, without much of sort of even noting the contradiction.
Yeah, they think of like the war on terror as this straw man and the specific invasion of Iraq as this one-off anomaly thing. And any future wars, as long as we don't call them wars, it's all good, So they have no problem with bombing this place or that place as long as we're not committed to like long-term counterinsurgencies and nation building. So they're fine with creating wreckage. They just don't want to have to rebuild anything.
Absolutely.
Well, before we let you go, Van, I have one last question. As a veteran and a pop culture expert and podcaster, we all know that Trump likes his guys to be kind of made for TV, right? And Pete Hegseth, a big argument for him is that he looks like a commander. As somebody who is experienced and knows folks, in the military, has actual experience here, is Hegseth a made for TV character, or is he reflective of reality in terms of, what figures in that position should look like?
A Secretary of Defense, I would much prefer an old enfeebled man to a guy who's like Christian nationalist tatted up, Like, I don't want my Secretary of Defense doing burpees at 4 a.m. Made for TV. Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. It was really nice having you on the program.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a long time coming.
Yeah,
thank folks, you. Go to un-diplomatic.com to check out the Substack and go log into YouTube, subscribe to YouTube. Van, thanks so much, man.
Thank you.